The saying is true, and all roads truly do lead to Rome. And I know this may hurt a lot of people's feelings, but we have to tell the truth no matter what. There has been a movement with the old Tartaria mud flood narrative, and I'm just going to give you another twist on that. So, to preface this conversation, I'm not saying that those things aren't real, the buildings aren't real, that the technology even wasn't real. All that is real. The problem is was it really Tartaria? Was Tartaria this worldwide civilization with all this technology and now they're just trying to hide it from us, right? I mean, that's the narrative, which it is true in a sense. They don't want us to know about this technology. They don't want us to know about the buildings. But the problem is a lot of people that are pushing this narrative, which may be true at face value, we are missing the key element of why this subject is important in the first place. And the problem is with a lot of these people who are pushing the Tartaria narrative, which I'm not going to name any names because that's not what this video is about. But the issue is that they never mention Jesus at all. They never mention the Lord. And that's a problem for me. So can we make this narrative fit through a biblical worldview? And the answer in short is yes. I think we have a very strong case for it as well. And we've been presenting that case, whether it be on my channel or my podcast, and we're just doing the best we can with the information we have. And mind you guys, I've only been looking into this subject for a year, so I do not have all the answers, and I do admit that. I am just simply trying to gather as much information that I can and try to make a cohesive picture of how everything fits, knowing that we aren't living in the time that we really think we are. I mean, our whole lives we've just grown up and just thought, yeah, I mean, the book of Revelation is about to happen and we can clearly see it. It's unfolding before our very eyes, which I understand that. I get it. But too many of us are looking into what may possibly happen in the future and we are completely ignoring our past. So to begin the video, I'll just start off by saying that all this architecture that we once believed to be Tartarian, and even I did too, before this realization of what stratigraphy is. And we're going to get into that towards the end of the video. I'm going to present to you this information that Gunnar Heinsohn put out, and I'll let him say it because he can say it way better than I can. But with that being said, stratigraphy in short is a scientific discipline concerned with the description of rock successions and their interpretation in terms of a general timescale. So basically what it is that in the earth, there are layers, and we are using those layers now to figure out time and where things match up in our time. And I think Gunnar has presented a very, very powerful case. We are told that there have been several collapses in our world, but what stratigraphy tells us is that these things all have the same stratigraphic death. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean that in our history book, we have stacked these events and these centuries up like a ladder, like this. So they should be stacked on top of each other. So for example, you have one collapse, and then if there was another collapse, that should be on top of the previous, and so on and so forth. But what stratigraphy has told us is that these are actually in line and it's parallel. And through his research has proved that these supposed collapses that were spread out through the centuries actually all happened at one point in time. Now, what brings weight to this discussion really is the fact that if you guys have read your Bible at all and you look in the book of Daniel, chapter 7, and it's talking about this fourth beast. So we know that there was 3 kingdoms before Rome, and Rome was that final beast, which was more diverse than the rest. So what that means at this point in time, when this fourth beast is rising up to power, or is in power, they are going to be in complete control of everything. And what stratigraphy tells us is that is exactly what has happened, because whenever something is unearthed and they're digging up all these artifacts, what is it that they are always digging up? It's always Roman. And it's because of this reason that Rome's kingdom and power spread throughout the entire world. And this is why we have all this similar architecture everywhere. It doesn't matter where you go, it is everywhere. And I think the lie is we use that verse about how knowledge shall be increased. And sure, it it has a lot since even I was a child. But for us to assume that we are the most technologically advanced society in the history of mankind is truly ignorant thinking, in my honest opinion. And the simple fact is, because of these very reasons, that the guys that are talking about Tartaria do expose this very well, that like there was this ancient civilization and they had all this technology, they had free energy, and all that is true. But the problem is that it wasn't Tartaria, even though Tartaria was a real place. But all these buildings are actually Roman. And it's because Rome was that final kingdom that got taken out before Christ's return. And the whole problem with this thinking of this whole Tartarian movement is, like I said earlier, they don't bring up Jesus at all. But what I think, just like I had talked about in my video concerning the biblical ancient tree stumps, where it looks like a tree just got sawed right off the top, and today they call them mesas and stuff. And one that's real popular is obviously the Devil's Tower. But I had talked about it in that video that the reason why these people don't want to admit this is because they don't want to admit that God has judged the world before by water. And these petrified tree stumps, which were cut down by the Watchers, is proof that God did judge the world by water in our past. But as Peter said, that just as he judged the world by the flood, he was also going to judge it by fire one day as well. And if you guys have looked into meltology at all, this is evident. Once you see this, you can never unsee it. These are not just normal rock formations, because a lot of them look like they have windows, they're symmetrical, and they got definite lines. So if you take an honest look at what we call these rock formations, and just be honest, does this look like a rock? Or does it look like it has been melted like wax on a candle? And if you're honest, I would say that that is the case. Why are Christians afraid today to even entertain the fact that a lot of these events in the book of Revelation and Matthew 24 have already happened? Why is it that that's such a bad thing? Why can't we talk about this? Why are we being called heretics because we just say, Jesus kept his word. He said he was coming back quickly. Why is that an issue today? Why is it that when we are reading passages in Matthew 24, that we are assuming that when the disciples are specifically asking Jesus, when shall these things be? And what shall be the sign of thy coming and the end of the world? Why is it that we assume that he wasn't talking to them? But somehow we think today that he wasn't really talking to them, but he was actually speaking to us. Which, to clarify, for anyone who thinks that that may sound bad to say, God's word is still God's word. And we have application for it in our daily lives today. If you want to have a good marriage, learn what God said about it. If you want to learn how to raise good children, yeah, listen to the Lord, because he knows what he's talking about. So I'm not saying that it does not have any application for us today, because It does. And we truly do need the word of God because that's why we're in the fix we're in right now because people have forsaken God's word and have chosen their own devices. But my point is that when we read the Bible, for example, in Revelation, when John is writing to the church at Laodicea, that somehow that applies to the lukewarm church today. Like Laodicea wasn't a real place that has been destroyed and doesn't exist anymore. It's crazy. But back to the architecture, something that I thought about today, and I thought it was really interesting, and I think that you guys will think it's interesting as well. And just thinking that Jesus and his disciples were actually walking around in possibly the most technologically advanced time in history is it's hard to grasp, honestly, and it is mind-blowing. But I wanted to share this because I thought it was interesting. And this is in Mark chapter 13, verse 1.
And as he went out of the temple, one of his disciples saith unto him, Master, see what manner of stones and what buildings are here. And Jesus answering said unto him, Seest thou these great buildings? There shall not be left one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down.
And then the disciples go on and ask, well, when is this going to happen? But look at all these buildings that we've been talking about. And don't we have somewhat of that same reaction that the disciples did? Wow, look at these buildings. These are amazing. Now, put it in a different perspective that the disciples were actually talking about this architecture that we're talking about today. Now, that's interesting. My point is that Rome had worldwide control and it truly was a one world order. And what they're trying to do today has no comparison, I don't believe, than what they did in the past and what has already happened. Because I honestly think that they might just be using God's word for a playbook in deceiving us to think that we're actually waiting for all this to happen when it's clearly been in our past. Now, getting back to the subject at hand of just the architecture alone and how it is everywhere. And like I said earlier, when they dig something up, it's always Roman. But all of this architecture, it's all over the world, is found in Russia, Italy, the UK, Germany, North America, Spain, Mexico, South America, Austria, the Ukraine, Norway, Turkey, Canada, and many more. We're going to take a look into Gunnar and what he has to say about some things. And just to start off, Gunnar is asked how he got into his research and basically how it all started. And this is what he had to say about that.
In 2011, I was studying the end of the Western Roman Empire, the so-called Third Century crisis. And I was studying at the same time the end of the Eastern Roman Empire. It's not that precisely dated, some when in the 6th or 7th century AD. And I came to the conclusion that nowhere you can find a single site out of the some 4,000 cities of the Roman Empire. You cannot find a single site in which you have a collapse of civilization in the 3rd century. Then you have a new beginning, and you have a second collapse of civilization in the 6th or 7th century. There's in the stratigraphy of any city we have researched, there's only one collapse. In 2013, so 2 years later, I came across the major study on the archaeology of Eastern Europe, which included Scandinavia and went all the way down to Mesopotamia, to modern Iraq. And there we have another end of civilization dated around 930 AD. Since I already knew that there is nowhere a stratigraphy that shows us two wipeouts of civilization, I already knew that there will nowhere be three. So I came to the conclusion that all the three catastrophes, 3rd century crisis, 6th century crisis, 930s collapse, that they are all one and the same disaster that brought down the Roman civilization of Western Rome, of Eastern Rome, and of Northern Europe, Eastern Europe, the Arab countries in one hit. This brought the question, if we have a downfall of civilization in 930 in Eastern and Northern Europe, and we have another one in 230 in Rome. Remember, the last water pipe in Rome was built 226 AD under Alexander Severus. And then for 700 years, there was no water pipe built again in that city, no latrines, no residences, nothing. I had to decide how to date the final catastrophe and the final catastrophe of Roman civilization. And I decided that the 930s date is the correct way to go. Why? Because after the 930s, we have the beginning of the High Middle Ages with the famous German Holy Roman Emperors that were not called that way at that time, Otto I, Otto III, Otto I to Otto III. And if you count backwards from then, you end up in this catastrophe of the 930s. We even have a German or Germanic, whatever you call him, historian, Widukind of Corvey, who mentions that there were two comets and the mountains were exploding when the father of this first empire, Otto I, when his father, Henry the Fowler, had died. His death is put around 936, and somehow around that death, he mentions that there was a major catastrophe. So I decided to count from top down, and then I looked at Rome and I looked at Constantinople, and I said, what do we have for these cities? Let's start with Rome between 230 and 930. Can I put the date of 230 to 930? It sounds insane, right? It sounds quite crazy. And what I did was very simple. I looked for the basics: water pipes, toilets, food kitchens, residences. And there's consensus in mainstream that after the 230s, there are no latrines, no water pipes, no sewage canals, no streets built in Rome up to the 10th century. So I said, okay, that's fine. But then you may say, what about the churches in Rome? And here we come to one of the forgotten geniuses of Roman research. His name was Richard Krautheimer. He was expelled as a Jew from the German Archaeological Institute in Rome in 1934. And in 1942, in American exile, he wrote an article that's also mostly forgotten. And in this article, he wondered. Krautheimer wrote some 7 atlas-size volumes on all the churches of Rome. There was no person ever that knew more about the churches of Rome. He wondered that the Christian basilicas of the 4th century looked like pagan basilicas of the 1st century, that Christian basilicas of the 5th century looked like pagan basilicas of the 2nd century. But his wandering was not over. He also found that the Christian basilicas of the 8th century that looked like those of the 4th century and like those pagans of the 1st century. And then he found that the basilicas of the 9th century looked like the basilicas of the 5th century, that looked like basilicas of the pagans of the 2nd century. So he had 1, 4, 8, the same, 2, 5, 9, the same. And so I just asked one additional question. He may ask the question himself. I'm not sure if he did, but I asked myself if these churches, 259 or 148, were ever found in Rome on top of each other, one on the ruins of the earlier one. They never are found on top of each other. They're sitting at the same stratigraphic depth all over the city of Rome. So in stratigraphy, they are side by side. You see, has three fingers. They're side by
Hmm.
side, but in
I
the
see.
books, they're on top of each other. You see, so they are in a vertical sequence. In
Mm.
stratigraphy, they are in a horizontal line. So already we're clear. No toilets, no streets, no water pipes, no sewage, no kitchen, and now I could show that the churches of Rome, dated 4th, 5th, 8th, and 9th, belong to and first and second is the same as 8th and 9th. And so the same date I have for Eastern Europe, 930s for the end of civilization, I also have for Rome. It's a bit complicated, but in a way it's quite simple.
Gunnar also goes on to say that the sources that we have been given are completely scattered. So that's why it makes it hard to find a proper chronology and why no one really agrees on dates and what exactly happened.
So if you have sources, material sources, second, fifth, and ninth century. You have divided the sources that are stratigraphically at the same depths. You have divided them over second, fifth, and ninth century. You have a piece of a narrative for the second, a piece of a narrative of the fifth, and a piece of a narrative for the ninth century. So you have no complete image anywhere. So if I take out the time, I come to the point that I can, for the first time, write a reasonable history. So, uh, what does it mean, for example? Every learned person learns that the Christians were a strange bunch of people because for the first 3 centuries, they decided not to have churches. So, it's one of the great
Hmm.
enigmas. And when they start building churches in the 4th century, they started to build churches in the 4th century in the style of the 1st century when they have no churches, when they should have churches because their godfather, so to speak, Jesus, was a person of the 1st century. So now I can explain that they were not that strange, that they built their churches from the very beginning, but that this beginning, 1st century, is the same as 4th and 8th century. And they had more sophisticated churches in the 2nd century, but they dated 5th and 9th century. So I can suddenly write the history of church building, and I can see the evolution in this history of church building. The great Richard Krautheimer thought there was one original and then a first Renaissance and then a second Renaissance. And I say no, there was only one period, 1st century and 2nd century, with evolution, of course. And we have the development of churches right in the time when we have the development of Christianity. So I give you another example for the capability to write history, where today people throw out material because it doesn't make sense.
What's interesting is that Gunnar gets into talking about the Apostle Paul, and he's wondering how is it possible that very learned people that are not dumb deny that Paul ever existed. And honestly, people do the same exact thing when it comes to Jesus. And they say that there's no historical documents that prove that Jesus was a real person. And that sounds crazy if you actually think about that, because Gunnar's whole stand is that the Bible is actually a reliable historical document. So he at least defends it in that case. But even Josephus wrote about Jesus. And I got here Josephus, the complete works. And this is going to be in the Antiquity of the Jews. And it's 18.3.3. And it says, now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as receive the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ. And when Pilate at the suggestion of the principal men amongst us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive again the third day, as the divine prophets had foretold these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him. And the tribe of Christians, so named from him, are not extinct at this day. And here we are. Here we are still, even in the little season. I found it very interesting that Jesus did 10,000 other wonderful works, which, if we read the Gospels, not a lot was recorded about his life. But if you read at the end of the book of John, it says that if everything was written about what Jesus did, the books of the world would not be able to contain it. So there's so much more that he actually did that is not actually recorded.
Saint Paul is dated, his death is dated in the time of Emperor Nero in Rome, around 60 after Christ. And there are very, very learned people who claim that Paul has never existed. Why do they claim that? For very good reason. Apparently very good reason do they claim that. They said he is only known from his own writings, and most of his own writings are not his own writings. And secondly, he maybe still have been mentioned by one or two other Christian authors, but nobody in the outer world ever heard of him. And it's very strange. His disciples are all over the empire. They have struggles, internal struggles. They have struggles with the authorities. And all these authorities never mentioned. So these scholars, I knew some of them personally. Detering was the most famous, he died. They had very good reason to say Paul is an invention. I ask myself immediately, okay, if you have nothing about Paul and his followers outside his own Christian sources, what about in the 4th century? What about in the 8th century? And yes, in the 8th century, you have another Paul starting out of Antioch, as our Paul did. And the followers are called Paulinists or Paulicians. And in the 8th century, again, you have Paulicians, and they are persecuted heavily. And this we know from the Greek sources. So suddenly we have non-Christian sources that attest to the persecution, to the torture, to the killing of followers of Paul. So I bring together again sources that are hacked into 3 parts: 1st century, 4th century, 8th century. I said they're stratigraphically at the same depths. So I read them all together, and suddenly I can make sense of the history of St. Paul. This portrait of St. Paul was made by a German police department that usually is occupied with creating phantom images of a possible criminal that was seen by different persons, and they all make a sketch. And so the specialists, they try to come up with a reasonable portrait. The problem here we have that in the first 3 centuries of Christianity, and Paul himself in the 1st century, there are no images of this great world traveler. No portraits. And here you can see this. The portraits begin in the 3rd, 4th century. They are on the left side, the first 4 or 5. And then you have again a portrait of Paul on the right side in the 8th century. And if you look at the portrait carefully, you can see some similarity. So it looks as if at least one artist has seen St. Paul, but all these portraits are at least 200 years later than the death of Paul under Emperor Nero. So again, the Paul researcher said, this is all rubbish, we cannot use it. They don't belong to the time of Paul. And my answer again is, I understand your point. You cannot prove a man of the 1st century by showing a portrait of the 4th century. But if the 4th century and the 1st century are stratigraphically at the same plane, then you're looking at portraits out of the time of Paul, but we have to date him after the last portrait on the right side from the 8th century. Because if I look at the last one, I'm doing the dating by counting from the top down. So I have a known date of the first Germanic emperors, Otto 1, 2, 3, and I go down, and then I end in the 8th century and not in the 1st century that we have in the chronology. That's 700 years earlier. And again, then we have the argument, do we have anything in Rome where Paul was executed between the 9th century and the 2nd century, or the 3rd and the 10th century? And again, we have no latrines, no streets, etc., etc. Let's stay a second at Jerusalem. So we have the famous or the infamous war against the Jews, extermination of most of the Jews of their time, and it's the final date is put at something like 70 after Christ. And so then we have the same problem as in Rome. Why would the burial site or the mausoleum for Jesus be built or finished around 360 after Christ? Why would that be done? It's not well understood that Constantine the Great and his sons, including Constantius II, why would they build a burial for this Christian hero some 300 years or more than 300 years after his demise? And again, if we look at stratigraphy, we can see in Jerusalem that the Holy Sepulchre, what we call today the Holy Sepulchre, or since the 11th century, the Holy Sepulchre, is built on a Jewish quarry of the 1st century BC AD, not on something of the 4th century. But what is even more interesting is that the ashlars used to build the basilica and the round mausoleum of Jesus, these are ashlars of the 1st century BC and AD, Herodian ashlars. And so the stratigraphic evidence is that the burial site for Jesus was built in a 1st century stratum with 1st century stones in the 1st century in which he died. But we learn no, this was all built in the 4th century against the stratigraphy and against the material evidence of the stones that had been used. So again, the question, why didn't the Christians build churches in the time of Christ, is repeated, and why didn't the Christians build a burial site for Jesus in the site of Christ? My answer is they did. They did, if we look at stratigraphy and put aside for the moment the Anno Domini chronology. So
Dr. Heinsohn, what was
yes,
the catastrophe that what caused the catastrophe in the 10th century? That's my question.
I have only a speculation. Why
Okay.
do I only have a speculation? Because I would have to move into the sphere of astrophysics, and I'm not an expert in astrophysics. But I can tell you two things. One I already mentioned. It was Widukind of Corvey, the
Yeah.
Saxon Germanic historian, who wrote in the 10th century and who told us that there were two comets, or a double-headed comet, it's not quite clear, in the time of the death of Henry the Fowler, the father of the first Germanic Roman emperor, Otto I. That's a written source. And so these comets have occupied me because they are never dealt with in the history of the 10th century. So they're mentioned somehow, they're not hidden. The source is there, the source is online, everybody can read it. But I connected this source with material that is found all over the world. It's found on the last Roman strata. If you date them 3rd century or 10th century, it doesn't make a difference. It's called black earth, dark soil, in German dunkler Moder, in Italian fango, which is mud. You have this fango, this mud, on the Broom clean Forum of Rome, and I give another example. You have it in the territory of London, in two sides of the territory of London. One is called Londinium in Latin, and one is called Lundenwic. And in Londinium, the black earth that covers the Roman side is dated 230s after Christ. 1.5 kilometers to the west in Lundenwic, the same dark earth is dated 930s after Christ, 700 years apart. But the people of 930, they used the same streets that in Lundenwic, they used the same streets that the people of Londinium, 1500 meter to the east, used 700 years earlier. These streets were absolutely impeccable for 700 years. Again, I propose to look at the stratigraphy of these two sites, just 1500 meters apart, and then you have the dark earth falling at the same time around 930s. So that's one of the materials. The geologists have found what they call the younger alluvial fill, and you find it in valleys. And in the Earth's geology, we only know of two alluvial fills. The first one is dated around 10,000 BCE. I do not believe in that date, but I do not challenge it at this occasion. And that's the alluvial fill tied to the flood stories that we have in the Hebrew sources and in cuneiform sources, etc., etc. And then there is a second fill, and above many times in the same places, and it's a real extra separate stratum on the first fill. And the second fill makes difficulties of dating. In one place, it's always upon Roman material. In one place, it's in the 3rd century. In another place, it's in the 6th century. And again, in another place, it's in the 10th century. But the geologists that were occupied with it, they never found three such deluge-like catastrophes on top of each other, 3rd century, 6th century, 10th century. They're vertically in the same plane, and there's only one fill. But these geologists believe in Anno Domini chronology, so they have to do what they do is they say, we have this second alluvial fill, a deluge kind of fill, and it's running through the first millennium after Christ, 3rd, 6th, 7th, and 10th century. And I say stratigraphically, it's all 10th century. So there's material that came down, right? And if you want to have a catastrophe that brings down material and does not repeat itself on a regular basis, you would like to have a comet crossing the orbit of the Earth, losing material, and by losing material, slightly changing its course that it cannot hit another time. So that would be my not my explanation. I don't dare to call it an explanation. It's a brutal speculation. That's all it is.
Gunnar also goes on to talk about the Arab nation. Now, this is very interesting, but according to his research, the Arabs were the ones who conquered Jerusalem. Mind you, they were Roman citizens. So these Arabs were contemporary to Christianity at the time and also Judaism, which is similar to today, right? But if Islam was contemporary to Christianity in what we call the 1st century, then we're looking at Muhammad in a completely different light. So the lie with the Arabs was that they had forgotten to mint coins, and then all of a sudden they just remembered, and Gunnar gets into that.
But what you learn at the same time is that the Arabs were not able to issue coins for at least 600 years. They forgot the ability to issue coins. They issued coins, the Nabatean Arabs living around Jerusalem, they issued their own coins. And then they forgot to issue coins. And when they restarted issuing coins 600 years later, they just continued with the decourse of 600 years before, when they had forgotten to issue coins. My claim is the Arabs did not forget for some 600 or more years. They did not forget to issue coins. What we have done is we have put empty, archaeologically empty centuries between the Nabatean Arab coins and the Umayyad Arab coins. But that's not the interesting story I want to tell you. When you learn that the Romans destroyed Jerusalem, you learn that they razed the city and that the city lay waste at least up to the time of Emperor Hadrian for 60 years. But if you look carefully at who conquered Jerusalem, the high commander, he was an Italian in modern language, but the troops were all Arabs. You see, the Romans would recruit the soldiers where they lived. It was so Jerusalem was not destroyed by Italians. It was destroyed by Arabs. And this is well known because we have tombstones of officers of the legion that destroyed Jerusalem. So we have one big problem here. If Arabs in the service of Rome destroyed Jerusalem in 70 after Christ, why would they wait for 600 years to live in the city? Why would they do that? I get no answer to this question. But if I look at what these Arabs 600 years later use, it's on the right side here, it's a floor, a mosaic floor with this abstracted peacock pattern. So that's dated around 700, 800, 690, not so precise.
Right.
And at the left side, the model is from Pompeii. That's first century after Christ. So these mosaics are 600 to 700 years apart. So if the Nabateans, whose soldiers conquered Jerusalem, are the same as the Umayyads, then we understand that the Arabs moved right into Jerusalem after they conquered it. That's why the Arab ashlars sit right on the Herodian ashlars on the western wall. That's why the Arabs use the same mosaics, or if you go down, that's why the Arabs use the same Millefiori glass and the same glass bottles. They're put 700 years apart, and you cannot tell the difference. You can see that these glass items were even made in the same workshop. The same here, you have this Millefiori glass. It's a very sophisticated item, and you have it in the 1st century, and then you have it again in the 8th century. Today we do a very strange, we deal in a very strange way with the Arabs. We say, okay, you forgot to issue coins, you forgot to write, you forgot to make glass like this, you forgot everything. So that's a bit denigrating. But then suddenly we say, but 700 years later, you were geniuses. You saved civilization. You saved the Roman writings and the Greek writings. But it's not so much of a compliment. Why didn't they do their own writing, their own books on astronomy? And so why would they use the Greek and the Roman texts? So in reality, if you take out these 600 or 700 years here, the Arabs and the Romans and the Greeks were living side by side, and they were exchanging their scholarly ideas at the same time. And the Arabs were part of high civilization in the 2nd century and in the 1st century. They did not show up in the 7th or 8th century and were ignorant for the centuries in between. Not at all. I regard them as active partners in Roman civilization. And if it comes to these wonderful colored glass items, I think there are Arab inventions and Israeli inventions, because these glass workshops are found all along the Levant in today's Israel and today's Lebanon. The so-called Luxembourg School, a school of German Arabists, they established long ago that the oldest text of the Quran are Aramaic texts from the 1st century after Christ. But they believe in mainstream chronology, so they say they took first century after Christ texts to write their the Quran probably was written around 800, 900. They took first century material to write a book in the 9th century. And I think the book or the elements that form the Quranic book were around in the first century after Christ, which means in the time in which Arabs under Roman coats of arms occupy Jerusalem and make Jerusalem their center. The biggest building built in Jerusalem after the destruction of the Herodian temple are Arab buildings. We must not forget that these famous Umayyad palaces at the southern and western wall of the Temple Mount, enormous buildings that were just wiped out. We did not know about them until the 1970s when they were discovered by Israeli archaeologists, because they were wiped out in the 930s catastrophe. So when we think about that the Muslims first prayed to Jerusalem, so I say, yes, that's the time in which it was the first texts were put together, where they originated. And that's the time where Islam originated. But the date we learn about Islam around 700, 800, it's closer to the truth than the date we have for Jesus. Yeah, because stratigraphically, Jesus moves up to the 8th century, beginning of the 8th century, and his mausoleum, built by Constantine, stratigraphically 1st century, but in our chronology that counts from the top down, it's some time after 700, 730, 740. So we can see that Islam develops parallel to Christianity. And I go a step further. I think if I look at the earliest Umayyad coins, the Jewish candelabra, the seven, I assume, and that's a speculation, I call it a speculation, that Islam of the Umayyads develops as an attempt to keep Judaism alive after the Jews were mostly killed, wiped out by the Romans, which means under Roman leadership, by help, of course, of Arab soldiers that were doing, in quotation marks, their duty as Roman soldiers.
Gunnar is also making the argument that the German and Roman architecture is exactly the same, which is exactly what I was showing you guys in those pictures, that this architecture is so similar that it's almost indistinguishable from one building to another. And yet these are separated by thousands of miles in some cases. And how did that actually happen? It's crazy if you're not looking through it from a biblical lens and without this understanding that there was this fourth beast.
And one more thing, if we study the early Middle Ages, 8th century to 10th century, exactly 700 to 930, we say still it's a dark age, but then there are some wonderful exceptions, like Aachen, the palatial complex in Aachen, or like cities in Bulgaria, Pliska, Pleskov. They look like 2nd century Roman cities. The same style, the same material, the same types of marble, the same types of covering the brick walls with marble tiles to hide the bricks, etc. All 700 years apart, and it's again considered as a miracle. How could Charles, the great Charlemagne, how could he force, and there are no orders that he force his architect to build exactly as it was built 700 years before him? They would have had to become archaeologists. They would have had to become chemists, because down to the chemical fingerprint, The colors used in Germany in the 9th century for painting the walls have the same chemical fingerprint as the colors used in the walls of Rome in the 2nd century.
Mhm.
So again, if you look at them stratigraphically, they sit in the same stratigraphic depth, and no miracle has to be invoked to explain the identity of the color pigments.
And what I like about Gunnar, I don't know what he believed theologically, but he at least reverenced God's word in a way that hardly anyone does today, any learned man. But he at least considered God's word as a reliable historical document. So even though that the dates are wrong, the chronology is wrong, the events that happened in the Bible are correct.
I started with pre-Christian chronology in 1988 on my own when I separated from Velikovsky. I try to make a simple point that people can follow. If you write a chronology, let's say for a territory stretching from Italy to India, or even from Spain to India, you try to look for one item, one nation is the best, that has relations east, west, north, and south. And when you have dated this nation correct, then you have dated the nations to which they wrote letters dated correctly too. So that's the trick to do here. And the nation I'm talking about is called the Mitanni. The Mitanni were not known up to the 1870s. Up to the late 19th century, nobody had ever heard about the Mitanni. These were Indo-Aryan horse breeders. Up to the late 19th century, every learned person of course, had heard about the Medes, M-E-D-E-S, the Medes, also Indo-Aryan horse breeders. They were dated by a Greek chronology that we know from Herodotus. So they were dated around 600 before Christ. And they were famous for having brought down what by Herodotus is called the empire of the Assyrians under the first world ruler under the name of Ninos. And so this was the learned wisdom. These Indo-Aryan horse breeders come to dominate the Near East around 600 before Christ. Then we began the excavations and in the 19th century, and people found a peculiar cuneiform alphabet that was not Semitic. So there was the problem to date it, to call it and to give it a name and to date it. And the name was given by a great German Jewish scholar, Jules Aubert. He lived in the 19th century, so he was not expelled. He moved to France and lived in France. And he called this nation, we now call the Sumerians, he called them Proto-Chaldeans. Why Proto-Chaldeans? Chaldeans in antiquity were known as the sagest, as the most educated nation. So the Greeks wrote in their own books that they learned mathematics from the Chaldeans. So today we learn that these Chaldeans have never existed. But exactly where they have lived and where they had cities and where we know even the names of their cities, we found the civilization of the Sumerians. The interesting point now is that the Sumerians, in their own language, they call themselves the land of Kal. So they call themselves Chaldeans. And it goes further. We have so-called bilingual tablets. On one side, you have Greek, text, transliteration, not translation, but transliteration. And on the other side, you have a Sumerian, so-called Sumerian text that I call a Chaldean text. So today we laugh about the Greeks. They never heard about the Sumerians. They were so stupid. They were writing the language of the Sumerians, and on the other side, transliteration in Greek. They were too stupid to know what they were talking about. They were always telling these idiocies about the Chaldeans that never existed. Okay, so what happened to the Chaldeans also happened to their contemporaries, the Medes. The Medes are eliminated from our textbooks, and the Chaldeans are eliminated from our textbooks, but we are proud we have much older Mitanni and Sumerians. Now, the Mitanni have written letters to Egypt. The Mitanni had personnel in Israel, in Megiddo. The Mitanni had written letters to Asia Minor. The Mitanni had written letters to what is today Persia, to Elam. So the Mitanni are that nation that can date the entire Near East if we properly date that nation. I say the Mitanni are none other than the Medes that are eliminated from our textbooks. And the Mitanni, in the Mitanni time, the Pharaoh in Egypt receives letters that there are dangerous people in Israel, what we now call Israel. They were called Habiru, and they were dated around 1400, a little later than 1400 before Christ. And their leaders are called Dadua and Yeshua. And now an Englishman by the name David Roll, he claimed, and I think was all due right, that these Habiru under Dadua and Yeshua are none other than the Hebrews under David and Yeshua, his father. But as the Mitanni date as 1400 before Christ are not stratigraphic datas, neither was David Roll. So he believed in the date of David, which in the Bible is the date 1000 before Christ. So what he did was to put the Mitanni a little later, from 1400 before Christ to around 1000 before Christ. But then we have the great Israel Finkelstein, archaeologist in Israel. He said, there's nothing there in Jerusalem around the time of 1000. And he went so far to claim that there was no David, there was no kingdom of David. And that's a stark statement if we have the text, not only in the Bible, but the text about these Habiru under Dadua and Yeshua. And so Finkelstein said, oh, that's by chance. I cannot do anything about it. But what Finkelstein saw was that the special capitals on the top of columns that are called Aeolian capitals, and in Israel we call them Proto-Aeolian because we date them 1000 before Christ and not as everywhere else 600 before Christ. He discovered that they may be out of the time of 600 before Christ. And now you have just to add 2 plus 2. 600 before Christ, we have the Medes. We have the Medes. And if the Medes are the Mitanni, we have David and his father Yeshai in the time of the Medes. So they exist, and we cannot throw them out of the history books because of two wrong datings: 1400 for the Mitanni, that are the Medes of 600, and 1000 for David, who lives in the time of the Medes of the Mitanni in 600 BCE. And now we come to the final point of this. The Mitanni are brought down by another Indo-Aryan. His name was Atsiru. And the Medes are brought down by another famous Indo-Aryan, and his name was Cyrus. And I claim that Aziru dated in the 14th century BC, and Cyrus dated in the 6th century BC are one and the same person. So we have found the Medes, they go back into our history books. We have found their contemporaries, the Chaldeans, the Sumerians. go back into the history books, and we keep David and Yishai in the history books too, and we cannot throw them out just because the biblical date for David is wrong. The date is secondary. The story is primary, especially if the story is repeated in the Amarna letters with the Habiru and Yishai and Daduda, Yeshua and Daduda, Yishai and David. What we have in the Hebrew Bible is an exceptional book because it's national history, including world history of the known world of the time. And it's also a book dealing with religious matters. But the point for history writing is, of course, the history of Israel, of Judah, of the neighboring nations. And what modern scholars do, it's a very simple thing they do, and they do it in good faith. They take the date of the story in the Bible, David's story, 1000 before Christ. Then they look at an archaeological site, let's say Jerusalem, and they say, we do not find anything at 1000, and then they throw out the story. So I would say, yes, the chronology of the Hebrew Bible is wrong. The history is not wrong. So I deal with this period, first millennium before Christ, as I deal with the first millennium after Christ. You cannot throw out the stories because you believe in a peculiar date that you do not understand, that you just believe, and then you look at that date, and then you have the story and the date of the archaeological item, and the story don't fit, and you throw out the story. So you eliminate history. And what I try to do is write history for the first time in many fields, not in every field, but in many fields, by bringing the archaeological and the textual sources together and keep the dating at the side for the moment. Right. Don't throw out the story because it doesn't fit your dating. And that's what biblical archaeology is doing. Because the Israeli scholars, now I go back to first millennium after Christ, they believe in the same Anno Domini Christian chronology as their Christian colleagues. So they have no way to criticize each other because they have the same dogma. Since the Hebrew Bible was more or less the only history book mankind had for such a long time, all the mistakes of chronology in that book had to be adopted by anybody who became a historian. And so this chronology is now held against the book. And I say, don't hold the chronology against the book, hold the book against the chronology. Mm-hmm. And check the book against the stratigraphy. Forget the chronology for the timing, check the book against the stratigraphy. And if we look at the beginning of the terminology for the Bronze Age, it was developed by Danish scholars. Jakob Worse was one of them. And they had the beginning of the Bronze Age in Northern Europe in 1000 BC and the beginning of the Iron Age in 600 BC. Today, without 1 centimeter of stratigraphy added in Northern Europe, we start 3000 BC with the Bronze Age. We added 2000 years without adding 1 centimeter of stratigraphy to meet the date we have received more or less from the Bible, or exactly via Abraham the patriarch. So Abraham the patriarch dated everything openly up to the early 20th century. So when you read a chronology of BC times, so people were happy to start with Abraham. Later, they throw Abraham out because they felt embarrassed that they used the biblical figure, but they kept his date. They didn't change his date. So it's quite an awkward procedure they used. So in a way, we're still dealing with Abraham chronology without calling it Abraham chronology. Right, and again, we are throwing out Hebrew and other history because the stratigraphy doesn't fit biblical chronology, but biblical history, I think, quite well.
Gunnar talks about Revelation 20, and I know that we've been talking about Revelation 20 a lot lately as well. But when you hear him talking about it, he speaks of it as a matter of fact. Like this already happened. And he specifically says that Satan had been let loose already.
And there's one book in the Christian Bible that's the book of Revelation. And in chapter 20 of Revelation, you have this story that that an angel will chain in the time of Jesus will chain the devil, and after 1,000 years he will unchain the devil, and that will be the final battle of Megiddo, of Armageddon. And my assumption, but it's a rough, crude speculation. Cannot have no means to prove that. My assumption is that the decision for a year 1000 AD was a theological decision. That the catastrophe in the 10th century, that was the unchaining of the devil that was mentioned in the book of Revelation. And so the probably written by a Jewish author on the island of Patmos, and basing on the tradition. Again, we don't have many other authors anyway. So in the Bible, so the apocalyptic texts in the Bible, they deal with real catastrophes of the past, like the Exodus catastrophe. And in the time of Christ, these real catastrophes of the past, they were turned into prophecies of something that will happen in the future. And then something happened in the 930s. Big, global, up to the Yucatan. We didn't mention this here.
Yeah, we didn't go
Big,
there.
and so I think it was not far fetched to say, aha, this was the day of the Lord. This was the day that Satan was unchained after 1,000 years, and now we start counting from 1,000 AD, though we are only in 1000 AD, some 270s, 260 years after Christ.
So when people are asked how this cataclysm actually happened, a lot of them talk about a comet and such, and even Gunnar states that he can't stop thinking about this comet in a sense. And I find it very interesting that also in Josephus, it talks about a comet as well. And I'm going to share that with you guys right here. So this is in the War of the Jews, and it's in chapter 5, 6.53. I know that sounds confusing, but these are the numbers. And I quote, "Thus there was a star resembling a sword, which stood over the city, and a comet that continued a whole year. Thus also before the Jews' rebellion, and before those commotions which preceded the war, when the people were come in great crowds to the feast of unleavened bread, on the 8th day of the month Nisan, and at the 9th hour of the night, so great a light shone around the altar and the holy house that it appeared to be bright daytime, which light lasted for half an hour." This language is kind of interesting because when I was reading this, it was brought to my remembrance in Revelation that there was silence in heaven for how long? Half an hour. Could it be connected or related? I don't know, but I find it interesting. Let's continue. "This light seemed to be a good sign to the unskillful, but was so interpreted by the sacred scribes as to portend those events that followed immediately upon it. At the same festival also, a heifer, as she was led by the high priest to be sacrificed, brought forth a lamb in the midst of the temple." Now, this is insane, guys. If you think about it, they're bringing forth this heifer to be sacrificed, and then this heifer gives birth to a lamb. Now, if that's not some sort of sign from God, I don't know what is. And I'm going to skip down here just a little bit, but there was a huge gate that could hardly be opened and closed with the strength of 20 men. And this gate just opened. And the people who were of understanding had said this about the gate opening. Here's what it says. But the men of learning understood it, that the security of their holy house was dissolved of its own accord, and that the gate was open for the advantage of their enemies. So these publicly declared that this signal foreshadowed the desolation that was coming upon them. Now, think about it. That same language, desolation, the abomination of desolation. Now, this is something that is super fascinating. And even Josephus says that if one didn't see this, it would be hard to even believe. It would seem like a fable. Listen to what he says about this. Besides these, a few days after that feast, on the 21st day of the month, Jair, a certain prodigious and incredible phenomenon appeared. And this is interesting. He says the exact day that this happened. He says, I suppose the account of it would seem to be a fable were it not related by those that saw it, and were not the events that followed it, if so considerable a nature as to deserve such signals. For before sunsetting, chariots and troops of soldiers in their armor were seen running about among the clouds and surrounding of cities. This is so insane. And I know that a lot of pastors talk about Josephus. I grew up in the church, guys. Why have we never been told this? That there were soldiers in their armor running about in the sky. And there's even other accounts from other historians that are confirming this, what Josephus said as well. So you tell me, what other conclusion can we come to? The temple was destroyed. You got heifers giving birth to a lamb. You have a gate that 20 men can barely move, and it's opening by itself. And they understood that it was for the reason for their enemies to come in and get them. And then there's soldiers in the sky. God's judgment happened. He came just as he said he would. He kept his word. He didn't lie, for God cannot lie. And I hope you guys enjoyed this one as much as I did. Let me know what you think about in the comments, and God bless.